So hi and welcome to this event entitled Connecting Academia and the Field, a discussion about integrating restoration, scholarship, and practice. My name is Jillian Bloomfield and I'm here with my colleague MK Speth. MK, you can wave. We're representing the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative at the Yale School of the Environment. In addition to MK and myself, on our coordination team is a current YSE master's student, Lloyd Farley, who's currently awaiting a new baby, so he couldn't be here today. This event was made possible with the support from the Yale Forest Forum and the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment. So we're pleased to welcome you today to this three-part online event. So we have a lot going on. First, we're going to begin with a panel discussion featuring ELTI team members and faculty from the Yale School of the Environment. Then we'll break into small group discussions moderated by Yale student volunteers and ELTI volunteers. And finally, we'll come back to talk about the new Tropical Restoration Library and have a summary of ideas shared in the breakout sessions. So it's a full 2-hour event, and we thank you in advance for your help making things run smoothly and your enthusiasm and patience as we try to make the most of our virtual session. So just some quick guidelines for today. During the panel, please keep your microphones muted. You can have your cameras on or off to your liking, but save your questions for the breakout rooms. And then after we hear from the panel, that's when we'll split into the breakout rooms where we encourage everyone to come ready to share your perspectives and experiences. So at that point, you can turn your cameras all on, speak if you're able, use raise hand and other features. And just a note, we are recording this session and we will post it to the to ELTI's YouTube channel, the parts that are the panel and the closing, not the breakout sessions. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce the moderators of our panel, Dr. Eva Guerin and Dr. Alicia Kaye. Dr. Guerin has spent over 25 years working on the social aspects of conservation and development in the tropics. She currently works as the director and principal investigator of the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative. And Dr. Alicia Kaye has been working at the intersection of tropical forest restoration and agroecology for over 10 years, mostly in Latin America. In her applied research work, her focus is on engaging farmers in sustainable production and conservation practices and understanding what impact those decisions have on the landscape. So go ahead, Eva and Alicia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jillian. And a special thank you to Jillian, MK, and Lloyd for organizing such an interesting and important panel session. And also thank you to the Yale Forest Forum for providing financial support for this event. So I'm just going to say a few words to help or sort of couch the discussion that we're going to have today. And then Alicia is going to follow with some words from her experience as well. So as the director of the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative, which we refer to by the acronym ELTI, I really find this event focused on linking academia and the field to be particularly compelling because linking these two entities is the underlying inspiration for ELTI's programs and activities. We focus on developing the capacity of landholders, practitioners, and decision makers to conserve and restore tropical forest landscapes using strategies that support biodiversity and livelihoods. And we design our field and online courses to integrate both knowledge and experience from a whole range of sources and disciplines. So this process includes developing training curricula that combine state-of-the-art academic research from the natural and social sciences with and wisdom from practitioners, landholders, communities, and others who are actively engaging in land management practices in the field. So for ELTI, our model for capacity development includes a combination of both training and follow-up support. So we provide people who take our courses with support to apply and share the knowledge they learn. And now many of our courses incorporate the experiences of landholders who are experimenting with a range of on-farm strategies in different socio-ecological contexts. And so the application of knowledge learned by landholders who participated in one of our courses is an exciting outcome for our model and can inspire academic analyses both in the natural and social sciences. So these landholders are experimenting with innovative and more sustainable land management systems, and there's so much to learn from their successes and challenges. So for example, the academic lens could focus on analyzing and documenting their experiences and the different forms of knowledge that comprise the systems that they are developing and managing. And their experiences can also inspire scientific analyses that are responsive to their evolving needs and interests. So there's clearly much to be explored and learned through a dynamic exchange of knowledge and experience between academia and the field, and each of these can influence and inform the other. So we're going to hear today from a distinguished panel of academics and practitioners, and several of them are actually fall in both categories, so that dichotomy is not entirely clear, but we'll hear from them and their experiences on these kinds of issues, which I'm certain is going to generate very stimulating discussion of ideas and thoughts about the importance of expanding collaborations and interactions between academia and the field, and how to accomplish what can oftentimes be a really complex and challenging goal. So thank you all for joining us today, and I very much look forward to moderating this exciting panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. So Eva has touched on how ELTI tries to integrate academia and the field. And I want to say a few words about the importance of linking research to what actually goes on in the field. That is how important it is for the work of managers and practitioners. I think this is especially important to address here at the Yale School of the Environment, because most of our students will go on to become either researchers or managers at some point. I actually went to the scientific literature, where else, to find information about what we know about the knowledge doing gap, which is how it is sometimes referred to. And I found one interesting article about how managers working in the field of ecological invasions. And I wanted to give you the perspective from the manager side, what the managers think about whether researchers are doing the right research, whether it's usable or accessible. And here are some of the findings. So as I go through them very quickly, just think about whether or not you agree. So in general, managers say that they find that researchers focus too much on basic over applied research, and that therefore their priorities as managers are not well represented. They find that the scale of research is not useful to their decisions because the temporal scale is usually less than 3 years, the cycle of research of a doctoral student probably, and the spatial scale is usually focused on only one site, where managers are usually trying to manage multiple sites. They find that there's a lack of reporting on costs, and scientists use methods that are way too costly to be implemented in the field. They find that there is a lack of interdisciplinarity in the research topics, which is something that they really would need. And they find that there's often a taxonomic bias towards some particular species and a very long gap between when the research happens and when it is actually happening. So they summarize it as scientific research focuses on knowing rather than doing. So in some this article at least found that scientific research is not exactly relevant to managers. It's not scale appropriate, usable, or timely. But the good news is that there is room for improving this collaboration between scientists and managers, and that is exactly what our great panel will be focusing on today. So let's get started, Eva. Let's go ahead and introduce our panelists.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alicia. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel of guest speakers. First, we have Dr. Oswald Schmitz, who is a professor of population and community ecology at the Yale School of the Environment. And he studied linking two important components of natural systems, biodiversity and ecosystem services. Dr. Schmitz examines these issues using field experimentation guided by formal mathematical theory of species interactions. And his research explains how predator and herbivore species determine the species composition and productivity of plants in ecosystems and ensuing ecosystem processes like nutrient and carbon cycling, with the goal of aiding efforts to conserve vital services that species and ecosystems provide to humankind. Then we also have Dr. Florencia Montagnini, And Dr. Montagnini is a senior research scientist at the Yale School of the Environment with a focus on restoration and sustainable management of tropical ecosystems. She's written extensively about the ecology of tropical forests, agroforestry systems, native species reforestation, and forest restoration, with an emphasis on Latin America. And then we also have Dr. Carol Carpenter, and Dr. Carpenter is a senior lecturer and associate research scientist at the Yale School of the Environment, with a primary focus on the social science of conservation and sustainable development. Dr. Carpenter teaches about the theories of social ecology, the social science of the global economy, relations between economy and ecology, and gender and agrarian and ecological systems. So Alicia.
Hey, we also have Dr. Amy Better, who has worked in applied conservation for over 30 years, integrating ecological and social science as a basis for conserving wildlife and wildlands. And she has conducted ecological research, launched wildlife and forest conservation projects, managed large field programs, and currently serves as a lecturer at the Yale School of the Environment. And last but certainly not least, we have Soraya Kaji, who is the Colombian coordinator of ELTI, and she leads the Ecological Restoration Group at the Center for Research on Sustainable Agricultural Production, known as CIPAD, in Cali, Colombia. She coordinates participatory research and capacity development focused on the synergy between restoration and sustainable farming in agricultural landscapes, mostly in Colombia. And I do want to say about these two last panelists, Dr. Better and Soraya, that they do not feel neatly within the category of just practitioners. They both have a research background as well. So this is something that they might want to address during our panel.
Wonderful. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here. We're just thrilled to be able to have this exciting discussion with you, and greatly appreciate your time and interest in sharing your experiences and ideas. So I'm going to launch the panel session with some opening questions. And as Alicia said, you know, and I mentioned previously, the boundaries between academia and practitioner are not always very clear, but we have tried to group people into those two categories, and I think there's going to be a lot of reaching out between the two. But I'm going to start with an opening question for what we've considered our sort of academic panelists, which are Dr. Florencia Montagnini, Dr. Carpenter, and Dr. Schmitz. So the question I would like to ask each of you, and we can start with Florencia and go then with Carol and then to Dr. Schmitz, but what is one example in which your research was actively applied by practitioners? So Dr. Montagnini, would you like to answer that first?
Yes, Eva, yeah, with pleasure. And I would say that practically all the work that I have done on research or my academic work since I first came to Yale in 1989, it has been applied in one way or the other by practitioners in the field. And the reason is, why did I come to Yale in the first place? When I was trying to make up my mind, do I come to Yale or do I stay in Costa Rica doing these little experiments in this beautiful country and don't worry about the cold of New Haven and everything? My thought was Costa Rica is a beautiful country, but it's a small country where everything is perfect, everything works. The true problems that are now happening in the tropics, and that was 1988, imagine that. Deforestation, rampage scales, and the hamburger connection was still there, and everyone was reforesting quotes, using exotic species, and oh my goodness. So I said, I can only make a contribution toward trying to solve these problems if I go to Yale, because I was trying to make up my mind or doing it or not, because at Yale I will have the opportunity first to get funding for my research happening not only in little Costa Rica, but also in Brazil, where things were happening in Latin America and the other countries of the world, and in my own native country of Argentina. So I said to myself, I'll try to see if I can get some collaborators from each of those countries so we can set aside big experiments, larger scale than what they have in Costa Rica, to see if we can use native species to improve soils for restoration of degraded land, all these abandoned pastures and all that. And at the same time, those systems have to be something that will be adopted later by farmers, because they have to sustain those systems in the long term if we are thinking restoration in a good sense. So that's how I came up with collaborators in the 3 countries. And the collaborators were mostly, there were a bunch of government and non-government institutions, academic institutions. For example, in Misiones in Argentina, where the deforestation at the time was horrible and still is today. But all the efforts were on restoring ecosystems using exotic species, pines. We got to collaborate with first an academic institution, the National University of Misiones, the School of Forest Science, with whom we signed a memorandum of understanding that's still current. And together with INTA, the National Institute of Technological Research. So those researchers, we had open discussions from the very start. I didn't come to them to say, I want to do this. I said, we talked, we had meetings, we chose people who were, for example, from the academic group, soil scientists, economists, an anthropologist, silviculture, foresters. So we put together this team of, we were about 6 people. And then we had people collaborating from INTA, and INTA offered their sites for our experimentation. And then the university decided what they wanted to do. So they said, these are the species that we want to research, because the research is mostly on pines and a little bit of an araucarias, which are native, but we really want to look at the lesser used species. So that's what we did. We did it because they wanted it. And today, a good example, so that's why I'm bringing this example, but in the other 2 places, in Brazil and in Costa Rica, similar things happen. Today, one of those people in the team, he was into policy making. He worked for the government, for the Ministry of the Environment in Misiones. So we conducted research for several years on what could be the best species for restoration, for enrichment of degraded lands. At the time when we started, enrichment was not even recognized in the government as a technique for restoring degraded lands. It was not for secondary forests. But then we did this research for about 10, 15 years. We came up with results, and we were able to touch the right people. So today, and this has happened like 10 years ago, the government gives incentives to farmers to plant the species that we selected and we found that were the best for enrichment. And now enrichment is a recognized technique in the country. So that's one example, but I can tell you similar examples. It was a conjunction of working with government institutions as well as with the academics in the field.
Dr. Montagnini, that's a wonderful example. Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to the next panelist, so we can get a rich diversity of answers. But thank you. That's a really interesting way of making your research applicable to practitioners. So thank you. Dr. Carpenter, do you want to comment on this question?
So very briefly, I'm just going to say that I'm an academic who doesn't get to do much research, so because of my position. So my main impact, and I like to think it's significant, has been through teaching. My research and other people's research, but mostly other people's research. And I do think that has had a significant impact. I mean, it's all, just students emailing me after years and saying, I've never forgotten this article or that article. So I think that's there. And then you can take it away and give it to Oz.
Great.
Either remaining.
Professor Schmitz. Yes. How about your experiences with how your research has been actively applied by practitioners?
So The example I'd like to give is an old example, actually, back in the 1990s, mid-1990s, when just soon after I arrived at Yale, there was a forest management company in northern Canada, Saskatchewan, Canada, called Mystic Management. They just started up then. They were interested in doing sustainable practices, and they were also interested in doing co-management, working with indigenous communities as co-managers of the landscape. And they looked throughout Canada for partners, and they couldn't find anybody who sort of had the collective vision, the interdisciplinary vision. So they actually came and approached us in the school. It was an interdisciplinary team of myself, Paul Barton, who was a hydrologist here, Mark Ashton, and Rob Mendelson as an economist. And we developed a team together to really evaluate, sustainable forest management up there. They wanted to do adaptive management. And what's interesting, the problem up there is the boreal isn't highly productive. So any kind of intensive management that you might do, which it costs a lot, especially if it's mechanical, will cut into your future profits. And so what you want to do is minimize the management costs. And so where my research came in is I'm a wildlife ecologist. I'm interested in, as you said, Eva, the interaction between predators and prey and plant communities. And at the time, the paradigm was that, all you had to do was make sure that you planted trees to regenerate trees and fertilize the ground or whatever to make sure you have highly productive landscapes. And the problem is, you get moose come in and they eat up the regeneration. And so we got to get rid of the moose from the landscape. And that's not sort of the theory that I was exploring in my own research. So we decided to work with them and do some experiments on how do you actually harvest the landscape in a way to keep the moose on the landscape. And that was antithetical to forestry, but the co-management, the Aboriginal communities really valued moose. And so we needed to keep the moose on the landscape. So how do you manage for something that the forest industry thought would be very highly damaging? Well, it turns out you can actually use the moose to be the technology to manage. So what they were trying to do is do mixed wood regeneration. They wanted to grow aspen and spruce. So the spruce is used for pulp and paper, and the aspen is used for oriented strand board, OSB. And so they had to, do a mixed wood regeneration, and moose are the perfect ones to mediate the competition between spruce and aspen. And so then we did experiments where we actually harvested the landscape in ways where, in a clear cut, moose are fearful to go out into the middle of a clear cut because they're afraid of wolves and they're afraid of being killed by hunters. And so what we did was actually do this kind of harvesting that's called patch retention, where you maintain moose habitat interspersed with the harvesting. And it turns out then you can keep the moose on the landscape and they mediate the competition. And it's a very effective way of using animals to manage your forest regeneration. And, we tried various trials in different cutover areas and everything. It was quite successful and it's still used today. So.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to hand this over to Alicia now to ask the question for our practitioners.
So the question for practitioners is, similarly, can you provide one example in which maybe your applied work was used for an academic purpose or inspired some kind of academic research? And let's start with Soraya.
Thanks, Alicia. I'm going to use an example from the work of my institution, from CPAV. So this is really a collective effort, not an individual work. During more or less 2 decades, CPAV worked actively in designing and implementing what we now call intensive silvopastoral systems. And the basic idea of these systems is that we should transform the conventional cattle grazing systems from grass monocultures into agroforests that combine grasses with shrubs that can be browsed by the cattle and trees for different uses. And there are two main effects of this: an increased productivity and profitability of the ranching system, and also enhanced ecosystem services. So we worked basically in isolation for a few years until academics they found out that this was happening. And then there was like a sudden interest in intensive silvopastoral systems. So, for example, in 2017, there was an article in Science called Restoring Tropical Forests from the Bottom Up. And basically, it used intensive silvopastoral systems as an example of how this could be integrated into forest and landscape restoration. On the following year, there was another science paper called Landscapes That Work for Biodiversity and People. And again, this was, they used silvopastoral systems as an example of meeting both the needs of people's livelihoods and nature. And then, this is my last example, there, in the New York bestseller Drawdown, silvopastoral systems are considered the 9th most important solution to climate change, and intensive silvopastoral systems are being analyzed as an additional solution that should be maybe researched by itself. So those would be my examples.
Thank you, Zoraida. And Dr. Vedder, your example?
Sure, and I'm going to use a collective example as well from where I worked for a long time with the Wildlife Conservation Society. So at the time I'm speaking of, I was managing an overall program where we were actually trying to learn across our programs, our projects, the applied work that was going on in the field. And, so much good work was being done, but it was rarely shared even within the organization, much less with the rest of the conservation community on a global scale. So one of the big issues that we identified as a group of practitioners, people in the field, was this really strong interest in ensuring that there was local capacity, local management ability to deal with natural resources, and yet finding that there were a lot of obstacles for that, and feeling like, if nothing else, the scale, especially because we were entering this era of landscape conservation, which was just emerging as a potential route for looking at larger scales and interactions across patches within these landscapes, and the importance of different communities, not just one. So looking at those scalar issues, and thought, how do we get beyond some of these obstacles, and what is the way to look at local engagement, local management, local power in the midst of these larger scales? It seemed to be a really tough issue to crack, and yet the literature at the time was beginning to emerge as, local management is the wisest, the most closely tied to the resources, and often is more significantly rights-based and all. And yet we were seeing that the actions for conservation of those resources were rarely, where we were working, were rarely initiated from a local level. So how did we deal with this discrepancy in intent and theory as well, and practice? So we gathered our field people together across, I think it was 10 or 12 different field projects across the world, and said, what can we learn from each other, from the applied work that you're doing? How do you deal with different stakeholders in your work, actually how you manage your work, and what is your intent, and what are the conditions that we should be considering? And so we took our field work, our field practice and knowledge, and then came out with an academic paper. So that was our tie to the academic literature, and hopefully it has inspired some other research on that level. But what we found was that there were big issues of scale, as I mentioned, issues of capacity, and often rural, remote peoples not having information at their fingertips, not having financial resources, being restricted in their allowance of how they were allowed to manage resources. But also that there were so we came down to 4 major sets of attributes that needed to be looked at, and one was capacity, one was power, and other entities in the region having more power, therefore overwhelming the power of local communities, especially at scale. Interest and mandate, official, legal, or informal recognition of rights and mandate and jurisdictional ability. And so having parsed that out from experience, looking at, therefore, how do various stakeholders cluster in terms of those attributes, thought, how does one deal with that information? And it took us back to issues of what is the nature of the natural resources they would be managing? Are they renewable resources? Are they abundant? Are they fragile? Are they under great threat? Again, what scale do they operate on? And so comparing what the management needs were, given those attributes of the natural resources, and what were the capacities and interests of managers locally, how does one match those together and try to come up not with a single management stakeholder, but how do you find a mix of stakeholders that match those concerns about the needs for management, as well as then the various attributes of managers. And so offering that to the literature was sort of drawing a good bit on Eleanor Ostrom's work on what are the conditions for self-organization in managing resources, but going beyond that and dealing with other issues of scale and mixes of actors, not just single actors, trying to inform the academic thinking on landscapes, management, devolution of power, et cetera.
Okay, thank you so much. Moving to our next question, and that's the same question for all of you. Have you ever worked collaboratively on an integrated project where that was both academic and applied in nature, meaning that practice was informing research and research was informing practice at the same time? If you could describe your experience, and if you have done this, what was the incentive? And if you haven't done it, what has prevented you from doing this? And I'm going to start maybe the other way around. Amy, Zoraida, Oz, Carol, and Florencia. Okay. Amy, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think I've been very fortunate in working in a practicing organization like the Wildlife Conservation Society, which has a lot of scientists on staff and in the field, and then coming to Yale, where there's a real honoring of the practice in an academic environment. So I've been involved in many interactions back and forth. I think it's been rarer, however, that I have been personally engaged in joint simultaneous work. It's one contributing to another or in the other direction. And maybe I'll let others talk because I think there's some obstacles for that, and we can come back to those obstacles instead.
Great, Zoraida.
Okay, thank you. So once more, I should talk about my organization, CIPAV. We are a small and autonomous research center in Colombia, and our work combines basic and applied research with project implementation and outreach and capacity building. So most of our projects are collaborative in nature. They involve academics, practitioners, and landholders. And most of our research is participatory. Farmers and practitioners are often part of research teams, and they are co-authors in different types of publications. And I would say that the experience benefits all parts involved because it integrates the perspectives of scientists, practitioners, and landholders. It also allows for very rapid feedback, which is very important, and it promotes an open dialogue between the generation and the application of knowledge.
Thank you. Oz?
Just building on the case study that I talked about, it was interdisciplinary from the get-go. And I think if you're going to do interdisciplinary, you have to actually have a good framework for organizing the thinking, making sure that everybody works together with the same concepts. A lot of interdisciplinary is often done by gathering a whole bunch of scientists and they do their own thing, measure everything in maybe a non-coherent way, and then try and slam all the data together at the end and trying to make some sense of it. We actually, in the Mystic project, Rob Mendelsohn had to figure out, how to make the forest management cost effective. And if we were going to leave timber on the landscape, this is merchantable timber, right? For moose management, to maintain moose habitat, you're giving up economic return, right? And so the challenge was to figure out how much merchantable timber do we leave on the landscape, and still, what's the minimum amount you can leave to make sure that the moose still hang around. And then, we had to also work with Mark to figure out what configuration should those patches be so that you get, good regeneration in the open spaces. And so we had to come up with a vision for how that ecosystem functioned. Plus, we were actually testing new ideas about top-down control of forest management by animals, right? So there was a basic research component integrated into an applied aspect to solve a problem, and it was quite fun. But it really requires having a team of people that can think together and believe in the same sort of framework and try and complement that framework.
Okay, great point. Carol, do you want to share with us? You're muted.
Okay, I'm here. So both of those examples were kind of inspiring, but I have to say, in my experience, this doesn't happen with social scientists, at least not anthropologists and geographers type of social scientists. With economists, maybe. I didn't know about Oz's example. And I think the gulf is just, it's so strong there that I have seen it among anthropologically trained policymakers in the World Bank specifically, who just see social science as a critique of practice and nothing else. And of course, there are plenty of critiques written in the social scientists criticizing projects. But even those critiques, some of them, the more specifically written, can be useful. So in teaching, I try to teach people to think around this gap. And I try to teach people that if you're doing an applied project, for heaven's sakes, read up on the social science literature, because there's so much out there that you can find out without having to do that research all over again from scratch. But it is very difficult, and it is on both sides. Practitioners tend to think theory is just about critiquing practice, and theoretical anthropologists tend to think practitioners are just failed anthropologists who are, before I came to Yale, trying to get a job, you had to be one or the other. And I actually had theoretical anthropologists accuse me of working for the CIA in my practice years, because I wrote one little paper for the Asia Foundation, which has some links, but it really is an uncomfortable and wide gap, and I have no idea why, because honestly, at this point, certainly any conservation, which is what I've thought most about, needs to have social scientists involved. We're not being able to conserve things as though people's interests weren't critical somehow. So anyway, that's my sad tale of a gap.
Okay. Thank you, Carol. And Florencia, do you have an example?
I'll start with the good and the bad. I'll start with the bad first, so I leave with the good. And the bad example that I had was several years ago. We had a big project funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Canadian International Research Development Center, IDRC, something like that. It was several $1 million, and it was started by people from epidemiology and public health of Yale University. And they wanted to get together a multidisciplinary team as possible, including social scientists, mostly ecologists. They needed us from Yale, doctors and practitioners in Brazil. And the project was linkages between land use change and the spread of infectious disease, zoonotic diseases in the Amazon. And the zoonotic diseases we were talking about were malaria, leishmaniasis, leptospirosis, hepatitis, all those that are carried by arthropods. And it was an excellent team. The team was put together from the start. We had several meetings, impressive meetings in Brazil, at Yale, and then we decided what to do. And that's when the fun started. Nobody worked together with anyone else. It was incredible. The social scientists worked on the population movements in Brazil and poverty and why people get into the forest and what happens when they get into the forest, blah, blah, blah. Poverty, all those things, livelihoods, what was wrong with all that. The ecologists, like me, little me, focused on the land use change and what could be the alternatives for land use changes, what you shouldn't do, what you should do, what kind of things you could grow instead of getting into the forest. The doctors used their money in looking at species of arthropods and connecting with the similar doctors in Brazil, and they were doing research on the diseases. And then we had meetings together and we were each reporting our little things, but everyone separately. There were other ecologists, it wasn't just me, Dan Nepstad from our school, an alumni of our school, several sociologists. So you couldn't blame it on one person. The leadership was very good. But it simply happened that there was lots of money, and what everyone saw was their opportunity to carry on their research. But we never were able to pull it together. We never had a publication with all of us together. Maybe we included one. Okay, yeah, I'll include a social scientist in my, something like that. But we never really pulled it together. And I think the key there is when you put together a team, and so now I go to the successful cases. In Argentina, as I told you, we were working with people from the School of Forest Science, from INTA, from government, the Ministry of Ecology, so, and sometimes private companies. In Brazil, we were working with the Center of Cacao Research, with the academicians from universities. In Costa Rica, again, we were working with the academicians from 2 different universities and government institution and NGO and some companies. I think a key, in my opinion, is that the people who participate in those teams, they have to be friends. I cannot see it in any other way. In the other example, all of them were excellent people, and individually you cannot say anything wrong about them. The excellent scientists, they published in excellent journals, but we were never able to pull it all together in one single thing. To me, it was very frustrating because I really wanted that project to go, and I did my best, but I couldn't. But in the other cases, in Brazil and in Costa Rica and in Argentina, with those restoration for degraded land studies using species that had value for the livelihoods of the local people. We went all the way from thinking the idea to actually being happy because the government is now taking our idea to the field, and being happy because the farmers, we send our students to the field to take pictures of the trees that now the farmers are planting from our recommendations. So we were all happy. but somehow I think when you form the team, you have to be sure that you are very good friends with the other people, friends in the
Okay.
broad sense of the word, friends and colleagues.
Thank
I
you,
think
Florencia.
the human factor was very, very important.
Okay, great. Thank you. Eva, go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you all. So we're gonna move on to designing and publishing research. And so I'm gonna start from the practitioner perspective, and maybe we can start with Amy first, and then Zoraida. So, do you engage with scientific literature, and for what purpose when you're doing your applied work? What would make this literature more accessible and useful for practitioners? And have you found ways, or do you wish that there were more ways that you could contribute your practical knowledge to scientific research? So, Amy, you're muted.
Yes, yes, and yes. You know, one of the things I think is probably a really strong commonality across all of this is that people practicing conservation and people researching topics related to it all want to better understand the situation they're dealing with, whether it's for basic or applied science purposes and getting that information out through publications, or whether it's understanding the situation, being able better to act within that context. So I think there's a strong commonality. And yes, I think that, and having been trained as a scientist, I always wanted to better understand and learn. And I was frustrated, and most of the field staff I knew were frustrated not having the time to be able to commit to research. Because there's an imperative when you're doing conservation of trying to see results that are effective, that are longstanding, but also in conservation that have really, you want that impact to be very soon. You see a problem and you're trying to help address it now. And so that takes me to one of these overriding subjects, I think, which is time, and the time committed to field research or to field work. For people who are practicing conservation is often on numbers of years of dedication to a place, to a set of people, to the resources they're concerned about. Researchers, academic researchers come and go more quickly on a different schedule. And so I think that time commitment is a disjunct at times. Some of your other questions. The time, therefore, and those even in the field who want to better understand, they have another job, which is to make things happen. They're managing projects or working within government systems or whatever. And so to take the time that it takes to better understand, to actually do research, even if they're qualified and would like to do so, is really limited because their job is other than that. And then one of the big obstacles that is much less so now than it was for those who are in the field and want to access information is that access. We didn't have digital journals. Honestly, when I came to Yale, I said, I have not stepped foot in a library in 30 years. 30 years. And I said, students, you're going to bring me up to date on literature, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the practice, and let's see where we meet. So to have access is much better now, but still, unless you have an affiliation with a university as a field practitioner, which most do not, you don't have access to the literature. And so you may want that understanding, you may want that information, but you can't get it for a number of reasons. There are a number of obstacles there.
Right.
I didn't answer all your questions, but that's a riff on some.
Wonderful. Zoraida, do you have any thoughts you want to share?
Yes, Eva, thanks. I would like to say that most restoration practitioners in tropical countries have a very limited scientific training, and they are not English speakers. And it's very important to recognize that scientific papers are not always practitioner friendly in many different ways. For example, their structure, the language, even the font size, the limited number of photos, and the extremely detailed description of methods and statistical analysis compared to the tiny, tiny, meager discussion of implications for practice if this is even discussed in the scientific paper. So we all know that scientific publications are essential to survive in an academic world, but scientists should be involved in producing materials for practitioners in different formats. This includes illustrated manuals, videos, web resources, even music, many different types of things. About ways to contribute practical knowledge to scientific research, we need to work together, meaning academics, practitioners, and landholders in participatory research projects in which academics can develop a clear understanding of the knowledge gaps faced by people who are implementing restoration on the ground, and practitioners can become aware of the methods and rigor required by scientific research.
Thank you so much. So interesting. And so now let's hear on the flip side from more of the academic perspective. So Oz, do you want to talk about when you design and publish your research, do you have expectations in terms of what will happen with that knowledge and how it will be applied?
You know, on that front, I'm quite cynical because for the reasons that were explained, there's a huge divide, and part of that is the academic journals themselves that we publish in. All of them want novel research because
Right.
you know, they worry about their impact factor. And so if you have something that's very basic research that has huge practical implications, you can't even get it published in a conservation journal because it's not novel and new, right? And these novel and new ideas are often really untested ideas, so they're not shovel ready either, you know? So the academics, even though they're claiming they're doing applied research or trying to inform nature conservation, they're so divorced from reality because of exactly what Zoraida was talking about, the way they describe their work, the way they report their work, the way the whole academic structure forces them to publish things that, you know, reinforce this ethic in academia that, oh, we're all working hard to save the world, but you know, the science doesn't get used, you know, and they're kidding themselves. And they don't want to change either because of the reward system of the way you publish. But that said, you know, back in the 90s, I really tried hard to try and get an online certificate program going in conservation through Yale. It's nice to see ELTI is doing it now, but back then, it's interesting, Yale actually thought that was the dumbest idea in the world. And this was ahead of the ability to really launch things online. And so it never really went anywhere. I couldn't get the administration to agree. But one thing that we did do, and we got a lot of money from a couple of foundations, was we recognized if you're going to do an online degree program or a certificate program, you actually need access to the academic literature. And so what we did was we worked with the UN and created OARI. I don't know if you've ever seen OARI. It's online access to research in the environment. And, you know, it worked quite well, you know, so there were negotiations with all the major publishing houses because, again, there's this huge paywall that, you know, people can't get access to the academic literature because they got to pay a fortune to get at it. So this was an agreement with the UN to actually open up all of the environmental literature that the major publishing houses publish. It's still in place today. The UN hosts it, but you have to you have to partner with some UN organization in your home country. But this was intended to give countries in the global south access to literature because they were poorer countries, they couldn't afford it. So now they have that access. I don't know if people realize or understand that they have that access, but that access is available. But the irony is universities in the global north can afford subscriptions to these journals, but the NGOs in the north can't, right? And yet OARI is not accessible for people in the global north because it's viewed, oh, those are rich countries, they should be able to afford it on their own. And most NGOs can't afford those because of the paywall again. So actually there's a discrimination against NGOs in the global north being able to access the environmental literature. So it's not getting out there. So even if practitioners could find value in the academic literature, they can't really get access to it. So.
As that's such an important issue. So hopefully we'll talk about more of that in one of the breakout sessions. Carol, do you want to give any comments about this question? Oh, you're muted. Carol, you're muted.
Why? Okay, sorry. I have to agree with both Amy and Oz. This is where I see power. So our publishing journals and presses are just not interested in many of them in the practical implications. And in my writing, it's always there. I mean, I just did a slim book called Power and Conservation. A lot of it is about Foucault, and I tried to write it to be comprehensible, though of course it's in English. And I'll probably never manage to get it published in any other language. And every chapter I talk about the implications of that particular kind of power for conservation, and how that particular kind of power works in conservation and why it matters. But I don't know if anybody will ever, read it. And the press was Routledge, and they had a new conservation series. And at first they were really excited that I might actually appeal to practicing policymakers and stuff like that. But as it went through the first year, they really wanted to know whether it would be used in teaching. And though it was built out of a course, that wasn't what I wanted to write it for. They also had a conservationist review it. Now, I have to say this wasn't a practicing conservationist. This was a sort of British political conservationist, let's say, who the only thing he liked about it was that I critiqued political ecology. Two of my three readers. And I don't slam political ecology. I don't say it's useless. I just say it's a certain Marxist-based understanding of power, right? But to them, they were refreshed that I would. So apparently political ecologists are their worst enemies. But the rest of it, they just said, we have no time for this kind of garbage. We are losing all our species. We need to be on the streets, right? So they didn't think it should be published. Fortunately, the press said, yeah, okay, we didn't pick a very good readers. So they made me put in a first chapter. They made me put a lot about conservation in it and the species disappearing and all that, which is easy to do. It's not like we don't all know that.
Right.
So, but still the barriers are incredible. So I definitely think we have to, and in truth, a school like ours has the best chance of it, but they're in my years here, and it's like 25 now. No, it's not 25. What am I talking about? It'd be 25. I'm not that old. I don't know how many is it 15? No, it's more like 25. Oh my God. I'm sorry. I can't. Mental math is not my strong point.
Great.
Never. 97. Anyway, it's been a long time, and I've never been asked to collaborate on anything to co-teach a course. I think the fact that I teach theory has been the kiss of death, and that I'm an anthropologist for all those years. And, you know, it's really too bad, because that's not what I teach. That's not what my students think. As several of you know. So it is interesting how that stuff persists and how hard it is to work against. So a lot has to change. I think there's a lot of sentiment out there that says we're ready to change it. I think the doctoral students we've produced are more cross-disciplinary. I think the students that just go back into practice will remember their lessons from theory. And that's what I live to do at this point.
Great. Thank you. Okay. And then Florencia, would love to hear some of your thoughts about your expectations about what will happen with your research.
Yeah, I very much coincide with what Oz was saying about the journals. You can't get those things published in a journal. But what has happened more recently in the last 10 years, the journals that kind of bridge the gap between the two are more abundant. There are so many outlets out there that really make the effort of taking those type of articles that bridge the gap between theory and practice. So this is changing, thanks God. But one major challenge that I had from the very start, because remember I've been talking to you about research in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Costa Rica, and those collaborators are from those countries, and they speak Spanish or Portuguese. So how do I convince people that we need to publish in English, because I am in the US, and so we had to negotiate that a lot. So that took to many conversations, and we ended up compromising. So one article would be in Spanish, the next one in English. In Spanish, there are lots of journals and publishers that publish books in Spanish. So there are enough outlets all over the place, and even more so now than 10 or 20 years ago or 30 years ago when we first started this. So now it's much more easy. And then my argument for them was, you need to write in English too, because then it'll increase your chances of getting some international funding. You can put and today it's the opposite. Now they ask me to participate in some article where everything is in English because they need it for their curriculum. Because now the standards have changed, so they do want their articles in English and in reputed journals in the US and Europe and all that. And then there are some things that we haven't still solved totally. Recently, this is something that didn't have a solution, in my opinion. Contributors to my upcoming book, which is in English, published by Springer, they were from Peru. They speak English, they speak Spanish, and they were talking about the vegetation, the flora, the vegetation characteristics and successional trajectories near Pucallpa in Peru, where they work, and they work at the university, which is a prestigious university of the Amazon there. These people are senior people, senior researchers, and they wrote a beautiful chapter, which they wrote first in Spanish, but they handled it in English themselves, and it was very well written. And then they were citing their own papers because they have been there for a long time. They're senior researchers, so they were citing their own published literature, which was in Spanish, and they were citing their own students' master's thesis that had been done everywhere in Latin America and in the US and everything. And then I sent the chapter out for review. And then this reviewer from the UK comes in and says, oh, they are not citing oh, leading work of these are some researchers from the Netherlands who have been in Peru studying this species, and they have focused on this species only, and they publish in all these, well-reputed. So I said to this person, well, I explained to this person the same thing I have explained to you. Why would they mention this person, this researcher, if they have their own literature? Oh, because like that. So that person got terribly angry with me, the reviewer. But I tried to calm this person down. And then I got back to the authors and I said, this reviewer, I tried to soften the language of the reviewer because that was like, lapidatory, like blah, blah. So I just wrote my own according to what the reviewer was saying. And this reviewer is recommending that you say this. And then I got myself the article. I took myself the trouble because these people in Pucallpa don't have the access to those journals where the internet comes and goes. And I gave them the article and they revised their chapter and they didn't mention that person. And I didn't ask them again. I didn't ask them again because they had made a decision. That was their own decision and I had to respect it. And they really, they could read it because it was in perfect good English. It wasn't in Dutch. It was a very nicely written article. But when I read it, I realized why they didn't mention it. It was an okay article describing some types of species that occurred in the succession and development of those forests near Pucallpa in the Amazon, in the Western Amazon. But their own literature was much more valuable, was much more complete. So I said, okay, that's it. So to me, there was no solution in that. There was no transaction there.
Okay. Florencia, I'm sorry. I'm afraid I need to cut you because we are out of time.
I just wanted to show.
Alicia, can I just add we've been talking a lot about the difficulties of linking knowledge and science and field because of publications. Mm-hmm. And one thing that Wesley Snell has mentioned is, what about gray literature? Can we get around or through some of those blockages by thinking about other ways of sharing information? So I wanted to bring that up. But I think there are also a couple other things just to throw out before we break up into groups that also make it tough at that intersection in publications. As people have said, there are a number of problems, but one is that there seems to have been a push for more and more and more specialization, which doesn't let us look at the holistic picture that field practitioners are dealing with. And we need some other communication mechanism to look at the bigger picture and share the complexity rather than trying to figure out all these parts individually. Yes. How do we look at that whole picture? And another thing just to mention, I think field practice is often looked at as the subject of research. And it should be noted that field work and field people and the people who field people work with are not, we should be very careful not to treat them as subjects, as objects, and that the implications of research can drop bombshells on people's lives, as well as succeed or hamper further work. So to make sure that the field component is not looked at as something to be studied, but something that is living, working research in being applied right now through life pathways is just really important. And to make sure that that is seen as not the subject of an experiment. And I've seen some really bad work done in the field where the implications, the impacts of what those researchers did on social and economic lives of people was something that we should never, ever repeat. So.
Okay, thank you. So now we're really out of time. So we're moving on to our panel. We do have a really interesting question, just linking to what Amy just said, but I'm going to ask you to maybe put your thoughts in the chat to the panelists. And the last question, which was, do you have any ideas on how to make research and practice more of a two-way process rather than like a one-way thing? And you can do that while MK is sending us off into the virtual.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. That's actually a really great jumping off point for our second part of this webinar, which is the breakout rooms. So first off, just thank you so much to both the panel moderators and the panelists. I thought this was a really wonderful discussion. So as Jillian mentioned at the beginning and as shown here, the next part of our webinar is the breakout rooms, which we really hope that all of you stick around in. There are 4 rooms which everyone has been assigned to, and these rooms are kind of a way to replace the traditional Q&A and are instead intended to be a space in which you can engage with the panelists, but also engage with each other to share your diverse experiences and thoughts on this discussion. So the breakout rooms will be centered on these 3 main questions. The first 2 are kind of general, similar to our panel, focuses on the gap between scholarship and practice, what those drivers are, and what potential barriers or challenges do you all face in bridging this gap. And then this last question is kind of the most important one and the one that Alicia mentioned, and that's sharing opportunities, recommendations, and/or tools to foster integration between scholarship and practice. So both sharing your own experiences of how you've done so, and also, in ideal ways, what you would like to see in the future to make this process easier. So just a few logistics before we jump in. Each room will include a Yale student moderator to direct the conversation, a volunteer note taker, and 1 or 2 of our panelists, along with a group of participants. And the group of participants. And the note taker is going to be recording the conversation on Jamboard, which when we come back together, I will share and we can talk through as a report back. We do ask that if possible for you to keep your cameras on, since this will foster a more dynamic discussion within the breakout rooms. And we also encourage you to speak out loud if possible, but be respectful of others and to allow everyone to have a chance to speak. If you are not comfortable speaking out loud, that's fine. You can also type your responses in the chat or use the raise hand function and the moderator can call upon you. So right now it is 1:15, so we might have to shorten the breakout rooms a little bit to 20 minutes. So we'll come back at 1:35. So with all that said, I think Jillian's gonna send you into the rooms. And if you do have any issues joining, you can private message myself or Jillian.
Okay, so for our final segment, I'm going to share with you one resource related to the themes of today called the Tropical Restoration Library. Then MK will be sharing the notes from the breakout sessions and provide a summary of key points. And then finally, we'll end with some upcoming events and opportunities. So just making sure everything's still working fine. Okay. So I'm pleased to present to you guys about ELTI's Tropical Restoration Library. It's accessible at restoration.elt.yale.edu. My colleague Ben Walter is going to be putting that information in the chat here. What it is an initiative that ELTI's had 10 years in the making, formerly with what was called a Native Species Information Clearinghouse, and now the newly improved Tropical Restoration Library. And this library has been sponsored by Arcadia, which is a charitable fund of Lisbeth Rousing and Peter Baldwin. And the idea is specifically with this goal of trying to bridge the gap between science and practice. So what is the library? It's a multidisciplinary tool designed to support restoration training, research, and implementation around the world. It's free and open to you and the public to help access information, explore literature, guides, and case studies from multiple sources and perspectives. And a big part of the motivation was to try to curate content with practitioners in mind. Unlike all the materials, everything available on the web, or the things, as Oz mentioned earlier, that require institutional library access, we've gathered information from multiple sources specifically on restoration themes so that it could be a centrally located place to go. There are useful browse categories and search features I'll show in a minute. And the content's been selected both for its utility and overall and on featured themes. And then another goal is to enhance access. So we highlight the open access content when an item's available and when it's only available by subscription, we provide a detailed summary of the content so that the user can learn from it and also determine if it's worthwhile to try to get a different way. So here I'll share a little bit about the features here while MK is finishing compiling the notes. So it does have resources in other languages, as you'll see up top there. And then one of the main features is the search function, which you can use to type in whatever you're looking for. And then you can filter results. So you can filter them by location or language or subject or other categories, and then get an output of priority documents to consider reviewing. You can click to further narrow, say by open access status. Or as I mentioned before, even if it's available only with subscription, that's where we've really tried to provide a user-friendly summary written in more common language, not necessarily the scientific language of abstracts, to give you the methods and key takeaways. So another part's the browse categories. So you can browse by location, either by using an interactive map here at the bottom, or going to a location where you can pick a country or get a list of references for that country. So here, for example, you can see we clicked locations, and then it has a whole bunch of countries and the number of resources available. And then everything in the system has then been divided so that you can get an output of just resources relevant to a specific country, for example. So then you can also browse by a few different categories, by ecosystem, by species. So that can be either browsing through a whole bunch of different options, or even typing in what you're looking for, or using the alphabet search. So you can type in a species, click on that, and get literature that's referring to that specific species. And there are definitely things that do this, that a lot of subscriptions that libraries have at universities, but the idea is to try to make this more accessible to people who are not with those subscriptions. And then finally, there are over 50 categories you can browse by theme, either searching an entire category or going to our featured section, which is an area where current master's students are writing syntheses of a specific theme that's of importance to us, and then picking out 5 or 6 key articles to consider for that specific theme. And so that's it for this part. I'll pause that and move on. So the idea behind the library, we wanted to share it as part of this conversation because it's attempting to do some of what we've been talking about, but it's just the start. There's so much more potential. Right now, it has around 60% of the items are open access. It includes journal articles, books, guides, and other publications, but mostly focusing on things from university researchers and NGOs. And right now, it's still largely serving to bring academia to the field, if that's working as a one-way stream. And so for the future, one of our main priorities for this coming year, and we're also searching for funding for longer term, is to increase the percentage of open access articles, even reaching out to authors directly, diversifying our sources of knowledge, and trying to find creative ways to showcase more local knowledge, connecting academia and the field. So bringing knowledge, local knowledge to academics, and connecting practitioners with knowledge from other practitioners. So trying to improve it in that way. And we want to hear your other ideas. So feel free to contact me at jillian.bloomfield@yale.edu if this resource or another type of resource that ELTI can help facilitate would be useful for your work. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to MK for the last 10 minutes.
Awesome. Thanks, Jillian. So as I mentioned before, during the breakout rooms, our wonderful student volunteers were taking notes on a Google Jamboard. And basically what this is an online whiteboard in which you can put sticky notes on simultaneously. So each room was assigned a different sticky note colors, and there's three or four different boards we're gonna go through. And while we were in the breakout rooms, I was kind of organizing and thinking about how each sticky note fit into different thematic groups. So I want to take this time to just kind of go over what I saw. I probably won't touch on all of them, but I just kind of wanted to draw out some really important points. So the first one is asking, where was the gaps and what is driving it? And what I saw is a lot of you talked about accessing information, and this either, as we mentioned in the panel, can really be physical, so actually, going past that paywall, or kind of just based on the fact that these information can often be in some jargon, or the information itself is not accessible, which, as Jillian mentioned, we're kind of hoping TRL is overcoming. Another important point on this is that, on the gaps, is that there are often divergent needs among the groups. So as this one yellow sticky note pointed out, that there's, institutional needs, research needs, local needs, and things like that. So how do we bridge those needs to, create a cohesive knowledge? And then finally, it was another point was the idea of valuing different types of knowledge. I think we often see that right now academic knowledge is much more valued. And we're really trying to create a world in which, both on the ground traditional knowledge is valued just as much as knowledge that's created in institutions. Jillian, you can go to the next one. So the next one were examples from your personal experiences, and I really enjoyed reading all of these. The one big theme I pulled out was the idea of building networks. So really using your positions as either practitioners or academics as both by connecting with people in order to, establish similar intentions. I did read that, there are some barriers to this, which can be tangible, such as language, but also less tangible ones in which, potentially a government needs is different than local needs. So how do we kind of ensure that all the needs are similar or in the same group? You can go to the next slide, Jillian. So just, the final slide was opportunities. And again, I think biggest opportunity we pointed out was the idea that we need to connect different groups. And I think Florencia really got to this in the panel, and the idea that almost if we're all friends, if you kind of create a social connection with the different people working on a project, you're much more likely to come together and discuss your different positions and, really bridge that gap between the groups. And so that way you can make objectives and outcomes more aligned. Another, which was interesting point that was on the previous slide, was someone wrote that we have to assume that people have the best of intentions. So even if your objectives are different from another group, I think you have to recognize where that group is coming from and why they have that objective. So that might be an interesting way to start building those networks. And then finally, just as again, when we said, just having information more accessible. So how do we as practitioners make sure we have our knowledge out there in which academics can access it? And also how can academics make their knowledge more accessible? And as this pink sticky note shows, I think gray literature is a really interesting pathway and would be interesting to explore. So also we are hoping to share these Jamboards with all of you, so they will be there for your reference. And I think that's it. So I will turn it back to Jillian now for some closing remarks.
I want to get to some announcements, but feel free to keep conversation going on in the chat. And then as we said, this is just the beginning. So this is a complicated subject to fit into 2 hours, but I really appreciate you all for your openness and flexibility for having the panel going into the breakout rooms and coming back and the sticky notes and everything. So I found it really fun. And so I hope you have as well. And like I said, just the start of a deeper conversation. Let's see, do you see my screen? Can someone, yes, okay, good. So I wanna just share that this two-hour event has been a major effort from a lot of people. So we have a lot of thank yous to say from our coordination team to our panel moderators, the panel speakers, all of the breakout moderators and note takers, additional support we got from a bunch of different people, the financial support and other communications and marketing from the Yale Forest Forum at the Forest School and at the Yale School of the Environment, and all of you all for your attendance. So thank you all for your openness again. And then my colleague Ben Walter is going to put in the chat. We also have a brief survey that we want to ask you to fill out afterwards so that we can keep providing useful opportunities for engagement, learning, and discussion. So we wanted to let you know that there are some upcoming events. The month of April is full of free online lectures on really interesting themes. So we hope you consider attending. First, a presentation from our fellow panelists, Zoraida Calle, on participatory research in the Colombian Andes on April 13th. And then from ELTI's Panama coordinator, Jacob Slusser, on the role of community associations in Panama's Azuero Peninsula, and that's on April 20th. Then the Forest Forum has a subject on the promise and practice of community-based forestry. And they have 4 really neat speakers coming up in April. And their sessions are on Thursdays at 11:30. And again, Ben's putting all of this in the chat for you. So thank you, Ben. And then letting you all know that ELTI's online certificate program, Tropical Forest Landscapes, Conservation, Restoration, and Sustainable Use, is still accepting applications through April 12th. I think all of the panelists you saw here today are instructors in that program, and a lot of the participants as well of this session have been participants in that. And so that's been neat to see. And if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to discuss more. We'd love to have you apply. And then finally, for more information, you can access, these are some sites to access about more information about ELTI in general, about the Yale Forest Forum. And so with that, again, I want to thank you all and everybody here for an exciting session. And please take care and keep in touch.